Okay, people, friends, such a pleasure. It's sad to see time going and our time together becoming shorter and shorter. Just means that we have more pleasure in all that is left from this great conference. So happy to welcome Mike J, who came all the way from England with his partner, and thank you so much for your effort and collaboration with your time and knowledge. He published recently a fabulous book. He's an independent scholar and writer. He's an author, journalist, and curator who has written widely on the history of science and medicine, specializing in the mind sciences and psychoactive drugs. His most recent book is Mescaline, A Global History of the First Psychedelic, and it was published by the prestigious Yale University Press. So I welcome to stage, please help me welcome Mike J.
Well, thank you, Beer. Thank you so much, and thank you for your presentation this morning. And it's a great pleasure to be here. And thank you to Kevin and to Liv for holding your nerve and keeping the faith and making it all happen. It's really appreciated. Also, I'll be speaking a little bit today about Native American history, particularly the Comanche people. So my thanks go out to Sia, who we'll be meeting in the next presentation, for their permission to name their deceased people and to speak about their story. So Uda, thank you. Well, when the term psychedelic was coined in 1956 by Humphrey Osmond, it really referred to two compounds, LSD and mescaline, shortly to be followed by psilocybin and DMT and many others. Of these two, LSD was a research chemical. It had relatively recently been synthesized in the laboratory, and it hadn't had any prior existence before that point. Mescaline, by contrast, had many lives in many different times and places before it became a psychedelic. It had been a research chemical for decades. It had been isolated, first of all, from the peyote cactus way back in the 19th century. And before that, the mescaline-containing cacti, the peyote and the huachuma, the San Pedro, had been used for millennia by indigenous people up and down this continent. So in a way, mescaline has two histories, not one. It has a Western history and it has an indigenous history. And they're very different. The Western history is focused almost entirely, not entirely, but largely on the crystalline white powder, the pure chemical substance. The indigenous history is focused entirely on the cacti. And these are two very different types of history. From the beginning, the Western history is really a history of personal experience. It starts with subjective accounts, first-person reports, often very focused on the visual effects, visions or hallucinations as they were called at the time. But if you look across to the indigenous history for these kind of accounts, you don't really find them, or only rarely, and mostly at the prompting of Western anthropologists. The indigenous history of the cacti is much more of a communal history, deeply embedded in tradition and culture. So these two different histories have kind of proceeded in parallel. They don't overlap very often. And what I was going to do today is just to look at a couple of important moments when they did overlap. So I found this photograph in the archives of the Smithsonian Institution, where it's just labeled peyote meeting, no date. but it turns out to be a very, very important date and a very significant moment. This is a chilly November morning in 1893 in southwest Oklahoma, in the Ouachita Mountains, the heartland of the Comanche people. And you may recognize one of these figures, second on the left, and kneeling down at the front. That's Quanah Parker, who was the chief of the Comanche people. And thanks to Sia, who know this generation of their people very intimately, I also learnt that the person to Quanah's right on the end of the row, hidden behind his eagle feather, is a man named Buiwat, who, according to Quanah, was the first of the Comanche people to adopt the peyote medicine. And also that those are two of Quanah's wives standing behind him. And the other significant figure here is one behind the camera, who's James Mooney, who was an ethnographer at the Smithsonian Institution, and at this point, one of the very, very few white people who was passionately committed to recording and preserving Indian culture and tradition. Mooney is best known for his report on the ghost dance, which is one of the great classics of American anthropology. He was one of the few white men to witness the ghost dance. He recorded its songs, he interviewed its prophet, and he witnessed the harrowing aftermath of the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1891. And after that, he came back to Oklahoma, where he'd been studying and researching, and he was invited to attend a peyote meeting a few miles north of here up the Ouachita River. After that, he became fascinated by the peyote phenomenon, and his researches suggested to him that its center of diffusion among the tribes was right here in the area that was, at this point, the reservation where the Comanche and Kiowa and Apache people were being kept in forced captivity. So he asked to come down here to find out about this, and Quanah Parker arranged the peyote meeting, the all-night meeting that had just finished when this photo was taken, in Mooney's honor. So right after he took this photo, Quanah had to go off for a meeting with a couple of Texas cattlemen who he was negotiating with them their rights to use Comanche land to pasture and graze their horses. Mooney then sat down and had an interview with Buiwat, who'd been the roadman during the meeting, and he said that Buiwat was extremely old by this point and almost blind, but still very vigorous after a full night of singing in the teepee. And then when Quanah came back, Mooney asked him if he could buy some peyote from him to take back to Washington for study. And Quanah sold him a big sack, a burlap sack, of about 50 pounds of dried peyote buttons, which Mooney took back to Washington. And those were the materials that were used for the first scientific trials of peyote, which took place at the medical school at George Washington University. Some of them were given to the Federal Bureau of Chemistry for analysis. Mooney also gave some to Silas Weir Mitchell, who was the great neurologist of that generation in America. And Mitchell took them and wrote a very, very detailed report of his experience. And then Mitchell passed some of his buttons on to his colleague at Harvard, William James. So this is really the very beginning of what we would now call psychedelic science. And this was the moment when it happened. So this is James Mooney and Quanah Parker. And these two people were the chief advocates for peyote at this point. And they were both defending it pretty much to the same people, to a white world that was predominantly hostile. Federal bureaucrats, politicians, missionaries, all of whom believed that peyote was a drug of abuse and addictive and degenerative and something that had to be stamped out before Indian culture could be assimilated and progress and become part of white America. And Mooney and Quanah both had, though they came from different worlds, they had very similar views about this. Mooney, after the ghost dance, saw that peyote was a real chance for Indian culture to survive and to flourish within the surrounds of a kind of hostile white world, whereas the ghost dance had been a confrontation that was inevitably going to end in tragedy. Peyote had the possibility of bringing Indian culture forwards. He also argued for it as a medicine. He said it had lots of valuable medicinal properties and that it was well worth investigation by Western pharmacy. And he argued for it as being a spiritual experience as well. Whereas most of peyote's white critics regarded it as something similar to alcoholism, Mooney argued that this was the opposite. This was, in fact, what was doing more than anything else to rescue the tribes from alcoholism. Quanah, similarly, he sat out the ghost dance. He had seen prophets and messiahs before. He'd seen where all that went. He was very focused at this point on improving the material conditions and the economic stability of his people, and he realized that the ghost dance would destroy that immediately. He was also a great believer in peyote's medicinal properties. He himself had first taken it some 8 or 9 years before this because of a serious stomach complaint from which he'd recovered. And he also stressed its spiritual value, where most white people saw it as a rival to the Christian church. Quanah stressed that it wasn't a rival, it was a complement to it. It was, in fact, a distinctively Indian expression of it. So his famous adage was, well, when the white man goes to church, he talks about Jesus, but when the Indian goes into his teepee, he talks to Jesus. In private, neither Mooney nor Quanah believed in Jesus or the Christian God, but they both understood that this was the way that it had to be framed and presented. So as well as all the psychologists and psychiatrists and philosophers who were interested in the peyote that Mooney brought back from his visit, it was also of great interest to chemists who wanted to find out what the active ingredient was, by which they meant the ingredient that produced the visions. And the first researches on this were undertaken by Louis Levin, here on the right, who was the great psychopharmacologist of his era in Berlin. And he quite quickly established that peyote contained a large number of different resins and different alkaloids. But his research didn't go any further because Levin was quite unusual among that generation of scientists in not self-experimenting with the drugs that he was researching. So he was then beaten to the discovery by Arthur Hefter, the figure on the left. He was a chemist from Leipzig, much less distinguished and well known, but he took the resins, he took the alkaloids, he started by swallowing a packet of all the resins and didn't notice anything much except a bit of nausea, and then worked his way through the alkaloids and found the one that produced the visions, and he named it Mescaline after mescal, which was another name by which peyote was kind of confusingly known at that point. So by this time, 1897, which was when mescaline was isolated from peyote, it was also available to Western pharmacy. Park Davis here in Detroit had in their catalogue a peyote tincture, a kind of low-dose peyote that they advertised as a cardiac stimulant. They said its effects were kind of slightly similar to strychnine. At this point, Western pharmacy was very rich in narcotics and sedatives, but it had very few stimulants. By far the most effective stimulant was cocaine, which had been Park Davis's big blockbuster drug in the 1880s. But by the mid-1890s, cocaine's reputation had kind of gone down the tubes. It was regarded as a drug of abuse, so they were looking around for other stimulants. So by the time the 20th century started, both peyote and mescaline were available to Western doctors and scientists and chemists. But the Western history of mescaline really starts in 1919, when it was synthesized for the first time in a laboratory by an organic chemist called Ernst Späth in the University of Vienna. And this really changed its character, and particularly the next year, 1920, when Merck Pharmaceuticals made it available as a research chemical. And this was now mescaline, the pure white drug, as it was called at the time. It was a kind of product of science, whereas before it had been thought of as a compound that had been produced from a cactus. Now it was just kind of one among many other white powders on the shelves, and the connection to the cactus and the indigenous culture was largely forgotten. And all through the 1920s, mescaline was used quite widely in scientific research, particularly in the study of hallucinations, which were a very strange and very difficult mental phenomenon to study, because the situations in which they normally appeared, psychotic episodes or high fevers or toxic crises, usually the subjects who were experiencing them were delirious and unable to speak very clearly about them. But scientists discovered that you could take a subject and inject them in a laboratory with 200 or 300 or 400 milligrams of mescaline. Then within an hour they would start to have these amazing dazzling patterns in front of their eyes, so they closed eyelids, and that they were still quite articulate. You could talk to them, you could say, "What are you seeing?" And they would reel off long descriptions of these ever-changing, fantastic forms. So researchers like Kurt Beringer at the Heidelberg Psychiatric University gave mescaline in this way to dozens of subjects and produced hundreds and hundreds of pages of what we would now call trip reports. It was harder, though, to make any sense of them, because they didn't seem to correlate particularly to personality types or psychological states. The most productive analysis was by a psychologist called Heinrich Klüver, who was at this point in Chicago, and he read through all of Beringer's reports, and he took mescaline himself, and he noticed that behind all these pages and pages of florid descriptions, there were certain kind of geometric patterns that kept recurring that he called form constants, like the lattice or the tunnel or the spiral or the cobweb. And Klüver speculated that this must be telling us something about the eye and the brain and the way that they work together to produce vision and the way that mescaline interrupts them. But even when he was writing about this, he was kind of aware that this was a superficial analysis of what mescaline was doing. He said, if you actually take this drug yourself, you realize that seeing these visions is not just like looking through a kaleidoscope. You know, they come with this very powerful sense of awe. It's a very profound experience. It seems to hold lots of meaning and lots of other concepts like this, which you couldn't really analyze in laboratories with brass instruments. So by the end of the 1920s, psychiatrists were starting to give mescaline to writers and to philosophers and to artists and to people who might be able to articulate the experience more fully and have deeper insights into it. So, for example, philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Walter Benjamin were injected with mescaline by psychiatrists. And this is I think, the first work of art by a Western artist under the influence of a psychedelic. This is by a Polish artist called Stanislav Witkiewicz, who was a society portrait painter by day and kind of wild avant-gardist by night. He wrote an amazing stream of consciousness account of his mescaline experience. He liked to paint under the influence of different drugs, and when he did so, he always regarded the work that came out as a co-production with the drug. So if you can look at this where he signed it Vic Cassie, which is his nom de plume, 1929, and then down there at the bottom, Merck. So this was done on Merck mescaline. Peyote was still in the Western pharmacopoeia at this point, but it had never really found, a compelling application. The great champion of it at this time was Alexandre Rouillet, a French pharmacist who wrote this really great monograph on peyote, which somebody should translate into English at some point. Rouillet grew peyote in a nursery up above the Côte d'Azur in the south of France. And he made his own preparation, extract, which he called pan-peyotal, which he argued was superior to mescaline because of its, what we now call its entourage effects. And he considered how it might be that peyote was, such a powerful medicine in indigenous culture, such a panacea with so many applications. Why couldn't it find an application in Western medicine? And he argued that, it was because Western medicine was biological in origin, which indigenous medicine wasn't, which meant that every medicine had to have a particular application, had to be suited to a particular condition. And there were lots of conditions that peyote was quite useful for, but it was very rarely the best of everything. I mean, it was a cardiac stimulant, for example, but was it better than digitalis? And also because it had so many effects, if it was kind of working as a cardiac stimulant, it was probably also giving you some nausea and maybe some psychoactivity and other things that you didn't want. So this kind of idea of a panacea was something that Western medicine, he felt, just couldn't encompass. The other problem that peyote had at this point was its association with Native American culture, where it was still portrayed as a dangerous drug. And in 1936, it was actually this preparation on the right, peyote a day, which was produced in Geneva, and for the same kind of indications that Rouillet recommended, things like nervous depression, neurasthenia, migraine, convalescence, a lot of things that we would probably now put under the rubric of anxiety or depressive disorders or chronic pain or fatigue. And the League of Nations Anti-Opium Advisory Committee thought that it was unsuitable to be giving dangerous drugs to these sort of weak and vulnerable people. So that was the point at which peyote disappeared from Western pharmacy, even though mescaline was still available as a research chemical. And at this point, the Native American Church, which had been founded in 1918 really for its legal protection under the First Amendment, was really starting to thrive. The early 1930s, the Roosevelt's New Deal, there was also an Indian New Deal and a new director of the Bureau of Indian Services, John Collier, who was very dedicated to preserving traditional practices. And so he retired all the old anti-peyote pamphlets and produced an executive order saying nobody was to interfere with Indian culture or religion. There was still a lot of repression of peyote and persecution of its users at local and state level, but it was kind of growing and spreading from this point on, across the whole of North America and in fact up into Canada among the First Nations. And there it was in 1956 that there was another of these very productive engagements between Western and indigenous cultures. This figure on the right you may recognize. This is Humphrey Osmond, so this is just months after he's coined the term psychedelic. And he's been invited to this peyote meeting by a Cree chapter of the Native American Church up in Saskatchewan, which was where Osmond was doing his research on mescaline. And that they were under pressure from the Saskatchewan government. Peyote was being blamed for all kinds of problems in the First Nations communities. So Osman wrote a report saying the experience had been very beautiful and meaningful, and it was a great credit to the tribes and their culture. But he was also very interested in what it might show him about his own practice. So he was very interested in the by now very well established reputation of the Native American Church for treating alcoholism, and that suggested to him that alcoholism might be a good indication for the psychedelic therapy that he was just starting to develop. And he was also very struck by the beautiful ceremonial aspect, which resonated with the ideas that he'd been developing with Al-Hubbard at this point, which would later develop into what we now know as set and setting. So just as we can establish, find the beginnings of psychedelic science in a teepee in Oklahoma in 1893, I think we can follow the roots of today's psychedelic therapy back to a teepee in Saskatchewan in 1956. So in conclusion, are we seeing another convergence of Western and Indigenous stories here? I mean, I think in the febrile world of IPs and patents and licensing and clinical psychotherapy, not so much. But certainly in the community medicine that we were hearing about this morning and that Bea was speaking about, a different model of medicine that seems to be kind of reinventing some of these indigenous healing modalities. I mean, I think particularly of the military veterans grassroots initiatives for treating PTSD with psychedelics, the Heroic Hearts Project, and so on. And that makes me think in a way of Quanah Parker's first generation of peyotists, mostly young men, mostly grown up as and been brought up and trained as warriors, finding themselves in a world where those warrior ethos and warrior virtues were no longer understood or appreciated, and finding that the remedy for that was not professional medical expertise. The remedy for that is finding a peer group of people who have all suffered in the same way and who all understand each other's suffering and who found a way through and a way out and are prepared to support other people down that same road. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mike. I recommend the book for those of you who have not come right after lunch. His new book, I think it's being sold outside as well, Global History of Mescaline. We have some time for questions and answers. I want to invite the public, and I want to start off kicking off the questions and answers with my own question to you. I don't know how much you have been involved in the dramas of the psychedelic community of the United States, but here there has been a big controversy over decriminalization of peyote. And when Senator Scott Winter was drafting legislation to propose for California, some branches of the movement have asked that synthetic mescaline will not be decriminalized, claiming that this would somehow affect indigenous peoples. This is not a position shared by the major leadership of the Native American Church and other institutions. I was wondering how, as a historian that has studied the history of the appearance of mescaline, how do you understand all of this?
Well, I think we have to remember that it's well within living memory that Native American people who were taking peyote were taken away and imprisoned, that a whole generation of Native American people were taken off to boarding schools where their heads were shaved and they were penalized for speaking their own languages. So I think we have to understand that it's pretty hard for Native Americans to suddenly see the sort of white Western majority turn around and go, oh, this is a great kind of amazing amazing healing plant. This is, there's a very raw living history here. I think you, in your work on peyote, you've really zeroed in on on sort of conservation and cultivation as being the sort of thing that everybody can focus on together. And I think that's absolutely right. I think if there's not enough peyote to go around, everybody will fight. If there's ways that you can increase the amount of peyote that's available, then nobody needs to. And finally, I think we should also recognize that we have the Wachuma, the San Pedro, which is another mescaline-containing cactus with an amazing indigenous history, but it's one that grows incredibly fast. It grows all up and down the Andes. There's really no supply problem with that. And it's also really rewarding to grow and legal in many jurisdictions. So I think there are solutions to this conflict.
Thank you. I'm sure this is just a segue for the next panel where these issues will be more discussed in detail. So I invite everybody to stay over and learn more about Native perspectives. And want to see if other folks have questions. I can't see very well through the pillar.
Not quite yet. So keep formulating your questions, audience. Here's one.
Take your mask off.
Hello, Mr. J. Hello, I'm Andrea. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to ask, as far as reconciliation efforts with genocide and the history of indigenous peoples, how do you plan to, I guess, through capitalism and even just medical sociology, a lot of different isms that are not created for indigenous peoples at the centerpiece, how do we face away from that into a new world where perhaps we could acknowledge truly the epistemic injustices done onto indigenous communities while also preserving their overall interest? But,
yeah, that's a great point, and you're in the right place because Troy on the next panel has been working on this. Is producing the most constructive solution that I've heard on this. But I think it's very right. As we, as this becomes kind of, as you say, a capitalist endeavor. I think one thing that you can do is to take the capitalist value out of psychedelics. I mean, I come from Britain, where we can, at this time of year, we can go up onto our remote moorlands and we can pick our psilocybin mushrooms, and they're free, and we don't need any patents from any pharmaceutical companies, So I think, so yeah, I think we can take action as consumers by short-circuiting the capitalist model, but I think there's also much more to do that, as it looks like a psychedelic industry is starting to build. So I'm going to be sitting with you and listening to Troy on that next.
cool. Thank you so much for
Pleasure.
centering collective ownership in IPs and stuff.
Thank you for the summary of the history of mescaline, and to paraphrase the title.
Sorry, can you take your mask off? I can hear you better.
To paraphrase the title of your talk, can you imagine mescaline, a global future, as integrated into our world? Could you envision that a possibility?
Sorry, have to give me that again.
Can you envision mescaline, a global future, as integrated into our world, given your understanding of its history?
Yeah, I think there are efforts to bring mescaline. It's very funny, the fact that mescaline has kind of disappeared from the psychedelic landscape in the 21st century. A lot of the reason is the reason that Hamilton was talking about this morning, which is just that You know, a gram of mescaline is like 2 or 3 doses, you know, and a gram of LSD is so much more. And this is kind of, I think, why it disappeared from science in the 50s and 60s, was because LSD is so much more available. But I think also it's like the length of time that mescaline takes. It's a longer trip than LSD even, and a lot longer than psilocybin. It's often 10 or 12 hours. It's an ordeal, and I think, you know, the Native American church meeting really kind of uses that sort of, you know, the fact that it's a long all-night ordeal, that everybody sits together in a group, makes it very, very powerful. But I think, you know, within the clinical context, you know, when the clock is ticking on kind of medical professionals' expensive time, you know, it's things like that, I think, that have made mescaline hard to really utilize in the current climate.
Hi, my name is Sitar. I have a really deep and beautiful connection with peyote. And for me, it's a medicine. Just a question. Yes, I'm going there. It's a medicine that really connects me to my body. And I feel it has a lot of potential healing for the body. And you talked a lot about the hallucinations and everything that happens in the mind. And I would love to hear more about the healing potentials of peyote through the body, through somatic experiences.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I've been interested in the fact that I don't think it's widely known that peyote was available as a medicine, peyote extracts, working at a much lower level than the psychoactive level. And on that level, it does a lot of things. You know, it's a tonic, it's a stimulant, it's a booster. I do know some people who are working with extracts of Huachuma and San Pedro, and not quite microdosing, but mini dosing, you know, for energy and mood. And I think it has a lot of positive effects on that level. And thanks to the Huachuma, we can all join in the research on that.
Mike, in the last 2 minutes, since we have you, as a historian that has all this perspective in time, different from us regular people that don't have that big vision, how are you feeling about the current moment of the psychedelic renaissance, or where is it going? How do you see the future of this movement?
From my perspective, it is over-medicalized at the moment, you know, but I think that's... So, I mean, I'm not saying that it's not valid to use it in a clinical medical context, but for me, that's one context among very many. You know, for me also, the guided context is only one context, you know, and there's a much broader history of, you know, self-medication, which tends to just get called recreational use. So I think, you know, I'm really hoping that we're going to end up with a very, you know, broad, inclusive model in which people can use psychedelics in all kinds of different ways. But I'm also very aware that some of these ways are much easier to monetize than others.
So maybe a new wave, more holistic.
Yeah, and I think to an extent, I've found today very, very heartening, because there are so many people who are looking beyond the medical model in different ways and into, yeah, the community model, which is ultimately where, you know, for health and wellness is ultimately where it lives.
Let's please applaud historian and writer Mike J.